In the experience that I've had with labdanum and the shadow extensively is that of ancestral healing. And in ancestral healing work, on one level, we're always working with the shadow because there's stuff that we keep in the cells of our bodies that have been stored there, traumas, secrets from our ancestral lines that we know physically or we know exists, but we're not conscious of. The name of the plant from which the labdanum is extracted is called cistus ladanifer. It's a plant that grows in the Mediterranean. It's beautiful. It looks like a rose family plant, but it's actually from the Cistaceae family. And it has a rose-like flower with 5 petals, but the petals look as if they've been crushed and then opened up. And the Cistaceae is different from the rose. Often with this family you can tell the difference with the sepals behind, because there are the 3 main sepals and then tiny weeny sepals in between the 3 main sepals. The plant grows, as I said, in the Mediterranean in hot rocky areas and is mainly distilled in France and Spain, although now there's a species that's being distilled beautifully in Crete, and the cistus that we have at Cathy's is distilled in India. Now the difference between cistus essential oil and labdanum is that the labdanum comes from a gum that the plant exudes, and this is exuded through the leaves and it runs onto the bark of the cistus bush, and the cistus essential oil, which isn't called labdanum, which is the essential oil, is distilled from the branches, the leaves and the flowering tops of the plant, and gives a much greener oil than the labdanum. Actually, we did by mistake order some from a good friend of ours, and when it arrived we thought, wow, this can't be cistus. It doesn't, he's made a mistake, he's put the wrong label on it. It smelt sort of piney, and in fact it was cistus, but it was the essential oil and not the labdanum. Both are good for the work that we're going to be talking about, but we have over the years come to the realization that the labdanum is more powerful for shadow work. And because it's a resin, the labdanum that we sell and most of the labdanums that are available are actually absolutes, which are extracted through a process that involves a solvent. And if you want to know more about the differences between essential oils, absolutes, etc., there's a great course on Cathy's made by my son Jah called How to Buy Essential Oils, and it covers all the different types of oil that you can buy that are extracted from different plants. Okay, so the other thing I want to say before Florian starts to talk about the history of labdanum is that the labdanum, because it's a thick gum at the onset, when you receive it, often it's very thick and viscous and you can't just pour it out of the bottle. So either you spend some time heating it up in your hands, or if you want to pour it, we don't actually have this problem because we're usually using it just to smell, and we'll use scent sticks which we'll dip in if we need to. But if you do want to pour it, then either heat it in your hands, as I said, or heat some water not to boiling and put it in the water so that it then heats up. But then use it quickly because it'll very quickly go back to its thick, viscous state if you don't use it rapidly.
So I'd like to talk about the history and symbolism and what we know about how labdanum has been used. I started by doing a literature search, and there's really no scientific studies on what the psychological effects of labdanum are. There's one study I found of dogs in a shelter, and various aromatic products were used to see if the dogs would be calmer in the stressful environment of a shelter, and one of the ones that they looked at is labdanum. There is one study I found in rats where it seems to have antidepressant effects on the standardized test of depression in rats. But it was surprising to me because it's been such an ally that Most of the research is chemical research related to labdanum's use in the perfume industry. Going back to the history of labdanum, it's one of the oldest aromatic substances known to man. In reading up on it, it was already used in Egypt by the first dynasty, and already in the first dynasty, one of the attributes of the pharaoh was the flail. I'll get to that in a second. And then I was reading that even in pre-dynastic Egypt, before the classical Egypt that we know, there was a god, Min, who also carried the flail that is actually a tool for collecting labdanum. So it's a very ancient symbolic plant. The archetypal pharaoh of the Egyptians, the dynastic Egyptians, was Osiris, and he has a crook, like a bishop's crook, and this flail. Let me talk about the flail, and then we'll talk more about Osiris and why labdanum, since time immemorial, has been used for the shadow work. The flail, it looks like a rake, but it's got these strips of leather on it that people would run through the bushes and then collect the labdanum resin. So there's like a process of separatio going on, the alchemical stage of separating. And one reason that they think that Osiris had the flail was he was like separating among his people and within himself the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. And in a way that, like when in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the deceased soul comes to Anubis, that same judgment Osiris is in charge of. Osiris, is one of the co-founders of alchemy with his sister wife Isis. And again, labdanum has actually many of the old Greek and Egyptian names for labdanum. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce them, but they actually are the plant of Osiris. This was already a very precious substance way back then. It was traded between different parts of the Mediterranean. And one of the other details I found, Hesiod, who was a Roman historian, has his own version of the story of Medusa. We all know Medusa, we've mentioned her before in the context of the Death Mother, but Medusa lived on a mythical island that's actually called Systeme, and it's named after the cistus that grows there, and there she was intimate with Poseidon, and both Medusa and Poseidon are pre-Hellenic gods. They're these earth gods and goddesses. Before he became known as the ruler of the oceans, Poseidon was attributed as the cause of the earthquakes, and for me that's sort of symbolic of the unconscious, the oceans, the earthquakes. It's those powers that we cannot perceive consciously, but they're really powerful, like an earthquake, like the ocean, like the unconscious. And these two, Medusa and Poseidon, made love surrounded by cistus. So there's that symbolism of that shadowy realm that these powerful archetypes reside in. And this was actually before Medusa became the hideous figure that we know her as, because she slept with Poseidon, Athena turned her into the monstrous appearance that we all know her. Before then, she was supposedly one of the most beautiful women. And that, again, that opposite, the most beautiful, the most hideous, is very symbolic of the shadow to me, that any one attribute you can think of the opposing quality. Labdanum may also be in the ancient sacred Hebrew incense called the kefseret. There's a substance in it called orinka, which we don't know what it is, but many people with a lot of evidence feel that that ingredient in that sacred incense is labdanum.
So labdanum, as we said at the beginning of the video, is the oil that we use for the shadow, and that's why we call it the master of shadow work. So first of all, let's just be very clear about what we mean by the shadow. The shadow is all aspects of the self that we're not consciously aware of. So it's not either bad or good. It's just those parts of ourselves that we are not aware of. So sometimes it could be that our power and our strength is in the shadow. So first thing to get out of the way is that the shadow is not always negative. In the experience that I've had with labdanum and the shadow extensively is that of ancestral healing. And in ancestral healing work, on one level, we're always working with the shadow, because there's stuff that we keep in the cells of our bodies that have been stored there, traumas, secrets from our ancestral lines that we know physically, or we know exists, but we're not conscious of. And this is where Labdanum has been extremely helpful and a guide for my own work, especially at the beginning when I really was delving into what I could feel but I wasn't consciously aware of. And I worked with Labdanum for some months. In our classes and consultations, we're often leading people either on ancestral journeys or in parts of themselves to try and reveal information that is ready to come out, but is at the moment in the shadow realms. And this is the oil that we'll go to. Recently, I've just been sitting in my diary and focusing on what I'm working on at the moment, because my work is centered around ancestral healing. I was going deeper into some of the layers that I was peeling away in terms of my own ancestral journey. So I just sit and I allow it to lead me to those places that are ready to be revealed, and I journal. And I'm always extremely surprised and pleased, I have to say, of the things that I'm able to reveal from those unconscious realms that help me to advance in my life with the help of Labdanum.
As we've said, we've called Labdanum the Master of Shadows, and in our alchemical work we use it during the stage of separatio, which again to me is symbolic of Osiris. The other aspect of the shadow work that is in the symbolism and the stories of Labdanum is the Egyptian pharaoh's beard. And Osiris's beard apparently was different than the other Egyptian pharaohs. The beard is filled with Labdanum, and nowadays people use Labdanum as a beard grooming product, which I think is a really superficial use. For me, what the Egyptians did wasn't just cosmetic, it was deep spiritual technology. And if you think about it, the pharaoh was between the worlds, between the world of the living and the dead, and so to have this shadow master in your face, in front of you at all times, I think is reminiscent of that. It forces you to work through the shadow issues, which is like the ego and the unconscious. The realm of the living and the realm of the dead are similar opposites in terms of what's in the shadow and what isn't in the shadow. The other thing that traditionally Labdanum was used for, when ancient Sumerian warriors came back from battle, they would cover themselves in Labdanum. And it is known that Labdanum has some skin healing and anti-inflammatory properties, but again, I don't think it was just cosmetic or on the skin. It was really to shed all these shadowy aspects, or to process them when you go from battle back to the everyday world.
So on a practical level, Labdanum, what it actually does, it's in a way it holds your hand and guides you as you go into the realm of the shadow, which is the unknown realms. The things that are in the shadow, or the parts of ourselves that are in the shadow, are the parts of ourselves we're not aware of, so it's unknown. And that's where Labdanum really comes into its own, because it takes you by the hand and digs right down into those areas. And it seems in a way to know what's ready to come up, what's ripe. And it will keep on digging and keep on going until it has been able to bring those things up and into the conscious realm so that we become aware of them. And the way that we use it, as I said, we'll use it with journeying, we'll use it for people to smell when they're journaling. And one of the images that's very useful for myself, and that we've used with many of our students and clients, is to imagine these little tiny bubbles of information that are being released by the cells. It's like the cellular memory. The cells are opening, and these bubbles of memory that we're not yet aware of are being liberated, and they're being liberated by this action of the Labdanum that digs deep down, knowing what wants to come up. And then the Labdanum, in a way, accompanies them as they rise through the shadow realms into the conscious aspect. And our job is just to open up to these little bubbles that are coming up and be able to catch them as they come up. The only thing we need to do is to be able to catch that information as it rises to the surface. And that's really how Labdanum works. It's an oil that we definitely would not be without in our box of oils, because it's a real go-to oil for deep inner work.
And so one thing that's important, we're telling you about it now, you're obviously interested in shadow work, but we've traditionally said that this oil should not be used by the uninitiated, because if you give it to a client and say, here, smell this oil and I'll see you in 2 weeks, they may not be ready for what comes up. You really have to sit with someone when you initiate them into the oil and bear witness to what comes up. I think that's really important. Another way you can use it is just unscrew the bottle, leave it by the bedside, so that even in your dreams, which sometimes stuff comes up more easily, the labdanum will really dig even deeper.
And lastly, its resonance with family and family taboos is what makes it a great ally for ancestral work.
So I hope you've enjoyed what we've shared with you about labdanum. If you'd like to dig deeper, we have our online class, Aromatherapy and Medicine of the Soul, where labdanum is very prominently featured. You can also read our newsletter on email. You can sign up for that at AromaGnosis.com, our blog posts. And we hope that you can make labdanum an aromatic ally for yourself in your shadow work.
Please join us for the future videos on AromaGnosis.com.